Hi, everyone. Welcome to the next episode in our series on the most important battles in the Civil War. We're now jumping into 1862 and looking at the Peninsula Campaign. But before we get into this, James and I thought that it would be good to take a step back and look overall on the tactics of the Civil War, but not just the tactics, the military technology, why it was that it seemed generals were all playing by the same playbook, and they did things that from our vantage point would seem to be strange and maybe even suicidal and bad tactics to use against an opposing side that had rifles that could be accurate from a long distance away. So, James, just to get into these things, I have a question for you. Just hypothetically, if there were a short Frenchman who's about 5'5", 5'7", I don't know, and almost every single officer and general in the Civil War on both sides had a man crush on, what would we call this hypothetical general?
Let me think about that. That's tough. Napoleon?
There you are.
Napoleon Dynamite.
Great movie. I mean, it's one of the classics. But actually, to set that up, I was looking online earlier today to see if I could find a terrible pun about Napoleon, in reminiscence of our presidential fight club and our terrible jokes about Taft and how big he was. Couldn't find anything, though. So if you have any Napoleon jokes, now's the time to bring them out.
Oh, you know what? I've seen a couple, but I can't bring them to mind right now. My mind is too stuffed with Civil War right now.
I Googled online, and all I saw was a T-shirt that said Napoleon boned a party or born a party. So, hey, you will be a hit, and not at all a nerd if you wear that. But yes, the answer is Napoleon, and we want to talk about him because I think this will explain a lot about this episode and then future episodes, the grand strategy that many generals had. And it pays to talk a little bit about Napoleon because, this is critical to what's happening in the Civil War. So I want to telescope way out right now and describe what the Civil War is. So in a lot of ways, the Civil War is just another chapter in the very long story of how modern nations are still adjusting to a watershed moment in the history of warfare that happened about 1500. Separating the Middle Ages from the early modern period. In the Middle Ages, you had armies of a few thousand people. They were typically trained as archers, knight-at-arms. But with the early modern period, you now have much larger nations. They can collect taxes. You have armies with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. Most importantly, you have personal firearms. That means you don't have to be as skilled or as proficient to be a useful soldier as you would being an archer. Now, with this change and with this evolution that takes really centuries to consolidate, Napoleon is one of the most important generals in this period. I mean, you have other greats. You have the Duke of Marlborough. You have Frederick the Great. But Napoleon does so much that's revolutionary. He is, I would say to generals in the 19th century, he is the touchstone of military strategy in the way that Aristotle would be to a medieval philosopher, where he's the axis, he's the fulcrum, he's the atomic clock, whatever, you want an analogy you use to measure precision. What he does is he destroys the Holy Roman Empire, he defeats Prussia, he defeats Russia, Italy. He remakes the European political order into something that would remain that way until World War I. So first, let me just touch on his innovations, and the reason I'm mentioning them is these are exact things that generals are doing in the Civil War. And it almost isn't worth me recounting them because it happens so often, and me listing it would just be exhaustive. Okay, so he introduced many innovations. For artillery, he focused on the power of his guns, and instead of spreading them out to provide support for the infantry, he collected large mobile batteries. And this coordinated firepower could make significant dents in enemy fortifications. The other thing is that he used the Army Corps as a replacement for the division as the Army's main organization. And each of these corps, one corps was something of a miniature army consisting of infantry, artillery, and cavalry, and it only had about 10 to 30,000. But the advantage is it was flexible and compared to the lumbering juggernauts of Europe's other armies. So one of these corps could hold off a larger army unit until help arrived. And the entire army didn't need to march together. So military logistics are far simpler and allowed for surprise attacks against the enemy. Each corps could also quickly come to the aid of another in battle or exploit a weakness in the enemy lines. So what this did is it allowed Napoleon to fight battles at a time and place that suited him, and he could pick off enemy forces one by one rather than allowing them to combine. So the principle is to march divided, but then to fight united. And regarding innovations he brought to the battlefield, these are very important. He had three main strategies. The first was the move on the rear, or manœuvre sur les derrières. I have no idea how you pronounce it in French, but here's why this is significant. Before Napoleon, this is a gross oversimplification. Military historians forgive me, but war is really fought on one axis. You have two sides facing each other, and you have a lot of possibility within this simple configuration. Cavalry units can flank the other side. You can get really fancy, like Hannibal at Cannae with a double entrapment maneuver. You can do a Mongolian feigned retreat. But what Napoleon does is that with the move on the rear, an enemy was pinned by a feint attack, usually by a smaller force, and then the army marched by a hidden route to attack the enemy's rear flank and march on their line of communication. It took his enemies more than a decade to learn a countermeasure to this. So Napoleon emphasized the importance of turning movements also, and this is what that flanking motion is. And from ancient times, like the Spartan frontal assault, you'd have two armies pounding away at each other until one side would give way. But Napoleon developed the turning movement to effectively attack an enemy flank. So the effect was that the enemy being turned would be forced to adjust, and on the fly, it could throw them into chaos, and they might retreat or reinforce the flank, but then this would just expose another area of its defense. So this tactic essentially forced an attacking or defending army to scrap its battle orders and attempt to make quick adjustments, and if they weren't very well trained, then you had problems. So in the Civil War, this was the goal of all generals, to effectively execute turning movements against their enemies. The second factor, and I'll just mention these two real quickly, is to favor a central position when encountering two or more enemy armies. So this allowed Napoleon to engage each enemy separately and thus defeat more powerful forces. And the third maneuver was strategic penetration. You see this in Sherman's March to the Sea. You'll see this today. This involves smashing the enemy's corridor of defenses, followed by a rapid march deep into enemy territory to seize a city or town and use it as a base of operations. So this really threw out enemies because there's almost an understanding that, well, battle is won by an ink blot, where you're just taking piece by piece that's in front of you. But Napoleon simply went way past that and captured a strategic fort or a city far into enemy territory, causing their whole logistical, defense, communication system to crumble. So the goal wasn't just to defeat or dislodge the enemy, it was to smash them decisively in a single battle and removing their ability to fight. And they had to negotiate on his terms. All right, so this is something, again, officers, generals are trying to use these strategies on the Civil War battlefield, but they weren't as practically applicable. Number one, just because you have a genius's playbook and you use it doesn't mean you're going to have the same results. There's probably plenty of private investors out there who think that they can be Warren Buffett because they read the Berkshire Hathaway quarterly statements. But just because you have access to his playbook doesn't make you Warren Buffett. And just because you've read about Napoleon doesn't make you Napoleon. One of the big things, and James, I think you'll talk about this more, is changes in firearm technology. In Napoleon's time, you had inaccurate muskets, and at this time, close order formation is essential for maximizing firepower. But with the advent of new rifled muskets that are accurate from much further away, then you're much more vulnerable on the battlefield, and Napoleonic tactics don't work in the same way. So one factor with this is Napoleon warned not to allow gaps to develop in battle formation, but this is something that should have been carried up to the Civil War. Napoleon spoke of the inaccuracy of muskets and preached that linear formations should only be 2 rows deep because the first line would be in danger of being struck by the third line. But this was disastrous advice in the Civil War because a soldier could now hit what he was aiming at and making his soldiers sitting ducks. So one last thing I just want to mention with all this is, okay, so the generals are using slightly outdated techniques, and this leads to high casualty rates in the Civil War. But I don't want to look smugly at them because, I mean, there were tactical geniuses in the Civil War, no question, on both sides. And you didn't really have military science in the 19th century the way you do today. So Napoleon's innovations were revolutionary at the time. Like I said, he is the Aristotle of philosophy. And but at this period in the 1860s, technology is quickly advancing, but there's no manual that instructs officers how to harness the power of these new rifles and these new weapons. All that military trainers could really do was look at the European wars of Napoleon for guidance. So there was reading material about Napoleon that was encouraged for all aspiring military officers. And we mentioned in the first episode that at West Point it was taught to both sides. But what you have is that you have the linear attacks of European warfare that begin at the Civil War, and then it ends with basically trench warfare that you see in World War I. So Napoleonic strategy were on the cutting edge of military thinking even up to the 1850s and 1860s. So that's just some background context. So James, what else would you say about that?
Good stuff, Scott. I would just add, let me go a little more specific about the actual military hardware. The standard shoulder arm that every soldier was issued by the time of the Civil War was a rifled musket. Okay, now prior to the Civil War, in most wars, infantrymen used smoothbore muskets, and by that I just mean that if you look inside the barrel, there's nothing grooved or carved into it. It's completely smooth, and soldiers would generally use a perfectly round or close to perfectly round, as perfect as they could get it. But basically a round lead ball, which would be the bullet. And those were very inaccurate, as you mentioned. Their range, basically the maximum effective range was about 100 yards, and even that was iffy. So just imagine if Scott and I were standing on opposite ends of a football field. We're each on one goal line, and we try to shoot each other. The odds are we'd probably miss, especially since I'm a terrible shot anyway. But rifled muskets were invented in the couple decades before the Civil War, but they weren't widely used. A rifled musket has grooves cut into it all up and down the inside of the barrel. And what a rifled musket will do is it will put a spin on a bullet, and the bullet spins and it comes out and it makes it way more accurate. And it's kind of like this. I always use a football analogy. Okay. If you look at a good football quarterback, when they throw a pass, they have a lot of spin on it, right? They don't just like take it and just kind of toss it up there. They put a spin, and that makes the ball stay in a tight arc, and it goes farther. And it's more accurate. Well, the same thing is true with the bullets. But rifles had been around for quite some time prior to the Civil War, but they weren't used very commonly because you had to have a bullet that could catch the grooves. In other words, they had to be in physical contact with the grooves on the inside of the barrel. And with the lead balls they used, which were really balls, they would have to be really, really big so that they would touch the sides of the barrel. And so people would have to ram them in, but it was very, very hard to ram them, and they'd get stuck, and you'd have to clean them all the time. But what happened was there was a bullet invented by a French military officer named Minier, M-I-N-I-E, and it was called the Minier ball, or it was generally called the mini ball. It was Americanized. And the mini ball was a smaller bullet that you didn't have to ram quite so hard. You still had to ram it into the barrel, but it would go down much better. And it had some grooves at the bottom of the bullet, and it had an open area that would expand when it heated. Okay, so when it got hot, when the powder came down, it would expand, it would catch the grooves, and it would have a spin. And those rifles that used the mini bullet were effective at much longer range. So 400 yards pretty easily in a competent shooter, sometimes 500 or 600 yards, maybe even up to 1,000 yards if you had a really, really good shot. And so you can imagine the effect that this is going to have on tactics, or at least it should have on tactics. Whereas before, when you had these really inaccurate smoothbore muskets, like in the Revolutionary War, the Napoleonic Wars, Scott mentioned, even the Mexican War, for example, Mexican-American War, people would tend to do more of a frontal assault, okay? So they could march the let's say Scott and I are fighting a battle. He's got 10,000 guys. I've got 10,000 guys. My guys would get right up in their face, and they couldn't hit me until I was really, really close. And then I would try to shoot them at close range or bayonet them. But obviously, if he's able to hit me from 400 yards, then that's going to be devastating to my infantry. And so that tends to make frontal attack suicide. And the generals knew this. I mean, they knew about the technology, but we're going to see that time after time, they're still, despite the fact that they know how suicidal these frontal assaults are, especially against a good defensive position, even though they know they're suicidal, often we're going to see them happen anyway. I thought it might be interesting for our listeners, too, to know exactly what all is involved in firing one of these rifled muskets. The two most common rifles used were the Enfield rifle, which came from England, and the Springfield rifle, which were manufactured in Springfield, Massachusetts. That's just a little bit of trivia there. But and here's how you would actually fire one. Okay, so if you're an infantryman, and I used to do some reenacting, and so I've actually done this. Right. I've actually gone through the whole process. Yeah, except for the bullet, of course. We didn't use real bullets in our reenactments for obvious reasons. But what you would do is the infantryman would have a cartridge, and it's not a true cartridge, but it's basically a pouch in which they would tear off one side with their teeth, and in that half of it there would be gunpowder. So they turn it upside down and dump the gunpowder down into the barrel, and then they would tear off the opposite end, and that would have the mini ball, and they'd put the mini ball in the muzzle. Okay, so for people, I guess most people probably know what the muzzle is, but that's the business end of the rifle. That's the end that the bullet comes out. So you have to put the bullet in there, and then you have to pull out a ramrod and ram it down, and then put the ramrod back. There's a little place that it fits on that goes up and down the barrel. Then you actually take a percussion cap out of a pouch that's on your belt. You stick a percussion cap on the nipple, and then once you have that, you actually pull the trigger, and a hammer comes back. The hammer hits the nipple, which makes kind of a mini explosion. It heats up the gunpowder, and that blasts the bullet out. So it's a long process. It's very time-consuming. And the best shooters could maybe get 3 shots off a minute, 3 aim shots, maybe 4 if you're really, really fast. So you can see it's very, very laborious and time-consuming process. But as I mentioned before, most units used rifled muskets, and so you had really good range once you actually did get that thing finally loaded and ready to go. There also were some breech loading guns where you actually stuck the bullet in the bottom, the breech, which is the part by the trigger. Obviously, that's much more efficient, but the Army didn't want to use those. The Army was very conservative. The Army felt like if they did that, and you also had some repeating rifles, but not too many. The Army thought if they gave everybody repeating rifles that the infantrymen would just waste ammo. You know, they'd be too expensive. So neither side was interested in it, at least at first. Another thing that's changing is the role of cavalry. Cavalry was very important in Napoleonic warfare and in early 18th century warfare. Cavalry would be right in the thick of the fight. Of course, it goes back all the way to the days of the knights back in the Middle Ages. But because of the deadly accuracy of the rifles that we talked about a minute ago, cavalry wasn't really a key staple of combat per se in the Civil War. Cavalry was used more for 2 other reasons. One reason was, or one use of cavalry was that they would be used to disrupt enemy communications. So let's say you've got an army from the north marching down into the south. They have to eat, so they have what's called a supply line, usually along a railroad, but sometimes it would be wagons just going over land, regular roads, such that they were. And the cavalry would go around and go behind the other army and cut the rail and capture the supplies and burn the wagons and things like that. And so that was a constant problem especially for the Union. We'll talk later about cavalrymen like Nathan Bedford Forrest, John Singleton Mosby, Fighting Joe Wheeler, and guys like that were just an absolute terror. Another thing cavalry did was it was kind of like your intelligence operations. Obviously, they didn't have radios. They had telegrams, but they how would you know how many men are in the opposite army? Well, you send the cavalry around the side or sometimes completely around them, and they could make an estimate. They could also sometimes capture capture enemy soldiers, and they could give you information, good intelligence. So cavalry was primarily used to disrupt enemy communications and to provide intelligence for your army. Of course, the other type of unit is artillery. Those are cannons. Scott talked earlier about how Napoleon had decided to concentrate them and developed what's called the battery, which is just a whole bunch of cannons put together.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
Once in a generation, a podcast comes along with the power and eloquence to inspire us all.
This show will entertain you while you wait for that one. Join two best friends, author and former history teacher John Driver and comedian Johnny W. for hilarious and authentic conversations about life, history, culture, faith, and everything in between.
You can listen to Talk About That wherever you find your podcasts or at lifeaudio.com.
Hello, this is Dr. Doug Grotheis, host of Truth Tribe, where we seek the truth through reason and evidence about what matters most. And we are not tribal, since truth is for everyone. Please join me at the Truth Tribe as I discuss the reasons for Christian faith, the Christian worldview, and moral issues such as abortion and gender ideology. To listen now, go to lifeaudio.com or search Truth Tribe on your favorite podcast app.
Are you concerned about tensions in the Middle East? Do you wonder where we're currently at in the biblical timeline? Are we really in the last days? Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Carl Muller with the Inside the Epicenter podcast. Every week, my co-host, best-selling author Joel Rosenberg and I answer those questions and more. You'll hear inside knowledge of our meetings with leaders at the highest levels of government in the U.S., Israel, and the Middle East, equipping you to filter the news with biblically sound insights. Find Inside the Epicenter on your favorite podcast app or go to joshuafund.com to listen and subscribe.
During the Civil War, there were four major types of shot that were used in artillery. This is kind of interesting, and you read about all these, and some of them are just absolutely scary even just to read about. So you have, first of all, solid shot, which is basically your classic cannonball. It's just a great big ball, sometimes 12 pounds, 20 pounds or more, and those would be fired out of the cannon, and just like a giant bowling ball, and they would just roll through the line or fly through the lines, knocking people over, sometimes knocking heads off and things like that. But they didn't explode. The second type was called case shot, and that was an exploding shell. So that was like a cannonball, but it was hollow in the middle, and it had what's called shrapnel. I think everybody knows what shrapnel is, but it's just pieces of metal and things that when the actual cannonball explodes, you get this shrapnel flying all over the place, and it's deadly. Many people were wounded and killed from shrapnel. The third type was called canister, and canister was basically like a giant coffee can filled with small balls, okay, but like the size of a golf ball or sometimes smaller. And those would be fired, and the casing or the coffee can, so to speak, it would just dissolve or it would blow up, and then you'd have all these small balls shooting all over the place. So it's like a giant shotgun. Those would turn a cannon into a shotgun. And the other one is similar to that. It's called grape shot. And grape shot is like canister without the can. It was basically a bunch of small balls that were connected, welded. I don't know if it's welded, but they were connected to a central rod kind of. And it looked like a bunch of grapes, basically. It's like you had a big stem and you had a bunch of these metal grapes coming off of it. And that had a similar effect to canister. It would turn your cannon into a giant shotgun. So with all these developments, as Scott touched upon, during the war, entrenching became more and more popular. Entrenching just means digging a trench, digging like a ditch in the ground and getting in it, and hopefully also putting up a wall of some type or what's called earthworks, where you just make a wall out of logs and out of dirt and things like that. You had entire forts that were made out of earth or sand sometimes, and they were very effective because they could absorb a cannonball. So that's kind of where we are technologically. A lot of these are pretty new developments, and it's going to take the generals a while to learn how to adjust to these new technological developments, especially the rifle, because they had been trained in Napoleonic tactics. Most of the generals went to West Point, not all, but most of the generals on both sides, especially the top ones, went to West Point, and they were trained in the 1820s and the 30s, 40s, sometimes 50s. And they had been trained using classical Napoleonic military doctrine, and they had to finally come to terms with the fact that they needed to develop something new. And so, like Scott said, as we get to near the end of the war, it's going to start looking a lot more like World War I combat than something out of the Napoleonic Wars.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. It's sort of like early 19th century tactics with almost 20th century weapons.
Right.
Or one more question I have before we look at the background to the Peninsula campaign. There's an ancient weapon that all but disappears in the 20th century, and that is the bayonet. And
glad you brought that up.
I wondered in warfare, so how often, so the front line gets off their shots, they could be hundreds of yards away, but it takes a long time to reload. So is it often that there's one side will do a melee and then charge with their bayonets and the hacking begins? Is that a common fixture?
I'm really glad you asked that, Scott, because that's every Civil War historian's pet peeve. Is that the movies all love to show this hand-to-hand combat where people are stabbing each other with the bayonets, and they're clubbing each other with the back of the gun, and they're sometimes even fist fighting because it looks really cool. Like there's a big scene in Glory where they do that. I think every Civil War movie has at least some of that. It's just not as dramatic if your good-looking star is down in a trench 100 yards away. You're shooting, trying to keep their face hidden. In the movies, you want to see the face of the leading man. We want to see Denzel Washington's face, not just his cap, right? So, the bayonet was like like a knife. Now, they're not like later bayonets, like in World War I and World War II. The bayonet looks like a knife, like a big knife, a Bowie knife, not quite as big as a Bowie knife, but it's just a regular knife. In the Civil War, they're kind of like triangular. They're like a really tall, skinny pyramid.
Huh.
And they fit on the end of the barrel, and they're designed to, if you do get in a jam and you're really close to your enemy and you're out of bullets or out of gunpowder, which happens a lot in the Civil War, people running out of ammunition, then you can stab them. They're very sharp on the end. But hand-to-hand combat and bayonet combat was very, very, very rare in the Civil War. I'm not saying it didn't happen. Obviously it does, and we're going to see some of it later on, but don't believe what the movies tell you.
It's not a highly choreographed fencing routine of hundreds of people tapping bayonet ends back and forth.
Right. Absolutely not. No.
Okay. Well, hey, that's what we try to do. Try to bring history, even if it's not sexy. So there you go.
Yeah. I mean, I personally love historical movies. Some purists say, well, everything is wrong. Hollywood always screws everything up. Well, they don't screw everything up sometimes, and they try really hard sometimes to be pretty accurate. But when you watch a movie on the Civil War or any historical time period, you always have to keep in mind that, yes, some of this is going to be incorrect. There will be liberties taken, but I don't think we should go into it saying, well, everything's just wrong, so there's no point even watching them. I completely disagree with that. I think they're really good teaching tools. I use them in my classes, film clips. Anyway, so I'll get off my soapbox now. Squeak! Oh, there we go.
All right, so Peninsula Campaign. What is the background?
All right, we're going to pick up last time. So our first key battle was the Battle of First Bull Run, in which I can summarize it very quickly. The Union Army marched down. They met the Confederate Army at Manassas, which is really only 30 miles from Washington, and the Confederates dealt them, as we say here in Texas, a good old whooping. And the Union Army skedaddled right back to Washington, and that was it. So it was an overwhelming Confederate victory. That's the first battle, major battle in the East, in the Virginia theater. The second key battle we looked at was Shiloh, and that actually took place out in western Tennessee. And that was the opposite. That was a Union victory, and there had been some other victories too. So far, the Union is doing well out in the West, but not doing well in the East. So we'll pick it up in the East. The Union Army is in Washington. cowering, and the Confederate Army is at Manassas Junction near Bull Run, about 30 miles from Washington. All right. So the commanders of the Confederate Army at Bull Run, first Bull Run, were P.G.T. Beauregard and Joseph Johnston. Beauregard was sent west. We actually talked about this in our Shiloh episode. He was there at Shiloh, and he was aiding Albert Sidney Johnston, who, of course, was killed in the Battle of Shiloh. But this left Joseph Johnston in sole command of the Confederate Army in Manassas. And in case anybody's wondering, there's no relation between Joseph Johnston and Albert Sidney Johnston. All right, so after the debacle at Bull Run, Irvin McDowell, who had been the commander of the Union Army, he was demoted to a division commander. And Lincoln replaced General McDowell with George B. McClellan. And George B. McClellan is a piece of work, let me tell you. I'm going to give a mini bio real quick. Let's sketch him out. McClellan, like most of our top generals, he had gone to West Point. McClellan was a brilliant student. He graduated second in his class. He'd fought in the Mexican War and done very well. He had been an observer in the Crimean War, so he had seen some warfare that wasn't super old school warfare. And then he came back to the U.S. after the Crimean War. He quit the Army, like a lot of our generals we're going to see quit the Army in the 1850s because there wasn't a lot of opportunity for advancement. I mean, you could be 50 years old and be a captain or a major or something. So it was a very, very small army, and you didn't make any money either. So McClellan wanted to make some money. He was smart and he knew he could. And he went into the railroad business, and he did make quite a bit of money. When the Civil War broke out, he volunteered his services and was made a general. He had had some early success in West Virginia, really at the time, Western Virginia. There was just one Virginia at the beginning of the Civil War, but the western part will split off and become a separate state, which is now the state of West Virginia. We'll talk about that later. That's in 1863, but we're still in 1861. So anyway, McClellan had some success in the western part of Virginia, and Lincoln taps him to come over and take over the army, the Northern Army. So he comes back and he reorganizes the army. He whips it into shape, and he renames it the Army of the Potomac. The army had grown to 168,000. McClellan was a superb organizer. He was great at training. He was great at drill. He liked to do parades. And he really lifted the morale of the army because they had been really downcast after Bull Run. They felt like a bunch of losers. Well, he made them feel like winners again. And by November of 1861, the army had grown to 168,000. So that's a huge army. McClellan was very popular with his troops. He bragged on his troops. He loved his army, and they called him Little Mac. He was a fairly short person as well, about 5'5", maybe 5'6". Now, in November of 1861, the Union General-in-Chief, the top-ranking general in the entire army, Winfield Scott, we mentioned him in our episode on Bull Run. Winfield Scott retired. He was about 75 years old and was not in great health. He wasn't really up to the job anymore. So Lincoln names McClellan as his successor. So that means that McClellan is, first of all, he's wearing two hats. He's got two jobs. He's general-in-chief of the entire U.S. Army. So he has authority over the West and the middle of the country and the East. But he's also the field commander of the Army of the Potomac. And this would be really too much for most people. And Lincoln warned McClellan. He pointed it out. He said, I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, it's going to be really hard to do both of these jobs. And McClellan simply said, I can do it all. So McClellan was not lacking in self-confidence, shall we say. He was extremely self-confident to the point of practically being a megalomaniac. So we'll see if he can really do it all or not.
Yeah, he's an interesting case where somebody who is that high up without significant experience, I mean, he was an observer, as you mentioned, so he has some contemporary understanding. Really, someone who can look at pieces on a chessboard and think that he can do it all, which apparently Napoleon could do. He argued that I fought 50 battles and never learned anything after the 50th because he somehow played it all in his head. Apparently McClellan thinks he can do the same.
It's interesting that you brought up Napoleon again because Napoleon, as you've mentioned early on, he was the model. He was the one everybody looked back on as the ideal. I mean, I think about, I'm a Texan, and so we study and talk about the Texas Revolution and a whole lot. The commander of the Mexican army during the Texas Revolution was General Santa Anna. And Santa Anna called himself, he also was extremely self-confident. He called himself the Napoleon of the West. And I think about James Knox Polk, who is our, I forget which number president he was. I could think about it, but I don't want to waste the time. He was the president in the mid-1840s, and he was called the Napoleon of the Stump because he was a great speaker. And that was the nickname. He did not give that to himself. He was a little bit more humble than Santa Anna. General McClellan was called the young Napoleon because he was only 34 years old. I didn't mention that. So we went from having our top general being 75 to 34. So, I mean, he was young enough to be Winfield Scott's son. He didn't call himself the young Napoleon, but that's what people called him. And he certainly did not discourage it. So he saw himself as kind of the new Napoleon, the Napoleon of the U.S. Army. All right, a little bit more about McClellan, and let's talk about his relationship with Lincoln before we get into the nuts and bolts military stuff. It's a very interesting story. McClellan was a Democrat. Interestingly enough, most of the top generals and the overwhelming majority of officers in the U.S. Army were Democrats. Of course, Lincoln was a Republican. McClellan believed in slavery. He had no problem whatsoever with slavery. He thought slavery was okay, was a good thing even. He just wanted to restore the Union to the status quo before the war. So McClellan basically saw this strictly as a war to save the Union, and that's actually the position of most Americans at the beginning of the war. There were very, very few people in 1861 that wanted to free the slaves in the North. In the South, there were none, but at least not very many, maybe a handful, but they kept their mouths shut. But McClellan just wanted to go down, defeat the rebels, and call it a day. And he was hoping for this big climactic, which one? Climactic,
yeah. But hey, whatever.
I'm trying to, not a battle that dealt with climate. But he wanted to have this big showdown where he would have one battle in the old-fashioned style, and he would defeat the rebels, and then they'd surrender, and that would be the end of the war.
Napoleonic decisive victory.
Well, that's right. There was no conception about total war. He knew what it was, but he certainly had no desire to go down and destroy the South and wreak havoc on them and redo the South in the image of the North. And again, he was not out of line with American thought at the time. Most Americans were hoping that we could just go down, whip the rebels, and be done with it, and just go back to the way things were before secession. McClellan also had no respect for Lincoln at all. He called him an idiot privately, and he also called him the original guerrilla. Because he has, long arms, long legs. And what's amazing is he called him that in public. and people heard, and they told Lincoln, and most presidents would be pretty darn mad. But Lincoln was humble enough and he didn't have super thin skin. He said, well, he can have his fun, whatever, but I just want him to go win battles. Here's another story that's interesting. One night, Lincoln and William Seward, his Secretary of State, who was really his right-hand man all throughout the war, Lincoln and Seward went to see McClellan at his house. Now, first of all, that tells you something right there. The president could have just said, hey, McClellan, come to the White House. The president has the power to summon his generals and his people that work for him to see him. But instead, he went to see McClellan at McClellan's house. And when Seward and Lincoln got there, the butler told him that he was out. When McClellan came home, he kind of slipped past and he took a route through the house so he wouldn't see Lincoln and Seward. He went straight up to his bedroom. And then after maybe 20 minutes or so, Lincoln asked the butler, can you please tell General McClellan I want to see him? And the butler went up and he came back down and he said, he says to tell you he's gone to bed. Can you imagine that? You work for the president of the United
you're
States.
34.
You're there at his pleasure. Yeah, and you're telling him, I'm too tired to see you right now, boss.
Yeah, that's one. Just as an aside about Lincoln, I mean, we think of him now as a mythological figure, larger than life. But at that point in 1861, many thought that he didn't have the temperament to see this war through. He was elected. There were many other contenders, and he had struggled with melancholy throughout his life, and so many people thought he didn't really have what it took to see the Union through successfully. So he wasn't universally revered by any means at the time, as we can see here.
Right, and I mean, he couldn't please anybody, at least not very many people. The radical Republicans, who I guess you would say were the left wing of the Republican Party, although we have to be careful with using left and right because they mean something very different than they mean today. But the radicals, who they really wanted to punish the South and hang Jeff Davis from a sour apple tree and things like that, they thought Lincoln was too wimpy. He was too soft on the South. When they found out about this, they said, "Oh, you need to fire this guy. I mean, he obviously snubbed you. He's being disrespectful. He's being insubordinate." And then there were conservatives who thought Lincoln was too radical. But Lincoln said, I'm not happy about this, but he put up with it because he really thought McClellan would bring a Union victory. McClellan had so much potential. He was brilliant, and he had done such a great job of whipping the army into shape and raising their morale. Lincoln said, I'm willing to put up with it if he'll bring me a victory. And I will say this, though, that was the last time Lincoln went to see McClellan. From then on, it was McClellan, no, you're coming to see me. Lincoln learned from his mistakes. All right, so in the fall of 1861, in the winter, Lincoln started dropping hints. You got this great army. You've done a great job of whipping into shape, General. Why don't you actually go down and attack? Why don't you take the army and do something? He wanted him to march overland towards the Confederate army, which was still in the vicinity of Manassas Junction. The summer passed, the fall passed, and nothing happened. McClellan wouldn't budge. He just said, I'm not ready yet. He kept saying, I'm not ready. I need more people. I need more time to train them. Finally, winter sets in, and winter campaigning doesn't work at this time. The armies very rarely did any fighting in the winter, and that's because the rain and the snows turned the ground into mush. And even the roads, such as they were, most roads were just dirt roads, as I think we've talked about this before, and we'll keep talking about it because this is a major factor throughout the Civil War. If you can't get your army from point A to point B, then you can't attack. So McClellan did one thing, I guess, to kind of try something at least, maybe throw Lincoln a bone. In October, he sent a small force toward Leesburg, which is up the Potomac, to the north and to the west. But this force was completely defeated by a Confederate force at the Battle of Ball's Bluff. Ball's Bluff was a very minor battle, but again, it was another loss for the North. And Lincoln took it really hard because a friend of his had been the commander of the Union troops, a personal friend, and he was killed in the battle. As a result of Ball's Bluff, Congress formed a joint committee to investigate the war. They investigated officers, and they mainly, a lot of the time, they just picked on Democratic officers. But I will say overall that it was a good thing because they did a large part towards eliminating a lot of completely incompetent officers, and there were plenty of those in the Army.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors.
Once in a generation, a podcast comes along with the power and eloquence to inspire us all.
This show will entertain you while you wait for that one. Join two best friends, author and former history teacher John Driver and comedian Johnny W. for hilarious and authentic conversations about life, history, culture, faith, and everything in between.
You can listen to Talk About That wherever you find your podcasts or at lifeaudio.com.
Are you concerned about tensions in the Middle East? Do you wonder where we're currently at in the biblical timeline? Are we really in the last days? Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Carl Muller with the Inside the Epicenter podcast. Every week, my co-host, best-selling author Joel Rosenberg and I answer those questions and more. You'll hear inside knowledge of our meetings with leaders at the highest levels of government in the U.S., Israel, and the Middle East. equipping you to filter the news with biblically sound insights. Find Inside the Epicenter on your favorite podcast app or go to joshuafund.com to listen and subscribe.
Hello, this is Dr. Doug Groothuis, host of Truth Tribe, where we seek the truth through reason and evidence about what matters most. And we are not tribal, since truth is for everyone. Please join me at the Truth Tribe as I discuss the reasons for Christian faith, the Christian worldview, and moral issues such as abortion and gender ideology. To listen now, go to lifeaudio.com or search Truth Tribe on your favorite podcast app.
All right. So is this campaign ever going to start, or we're going to, get into 1862, 1863,
Yeah, it's like you just can't sit there forever in Washington and hope that the rebels will just say, nah, I'm tired of this.
Yeah, it's just shocking when you consider the velocity of something like World War II that someone could just rest for a season or 2 seasons.
Yeah, months, just sit there. And yeah, he's more training. Okay, well, sooner or later, you got to do something with that training. Well, McClellan comes up with a plan. He doesn't want to march straight overland towards Richmond, as McDowell had done, because that didn't go very well. So he tries something completely different. He proposes a giant flanking movement. Okay, well, you were talking about turning or flanking, which is basically going around the side of your enemy and hopefully rolling up one of their flanks, getting behind them, getting between them and their supplies. Well, McClellan wants to do this on a grand scale. I want to stop and do another mental map. We talked about Virginia and what it's shaped like back in our earlier episode. If you think of Virginia basically as a big triangle, okay, the bottom border, the southern border with North Carolina is flat. It's east to west. And then you have, it's like a Pythagorean triangle. I'm sorry to get so mathematical here, but if you think of a right triangle that's flipped over, and so the hypotenuse is the long side, it's on the bottom, and then you have the 2 sides are slanting up to a point. Washington is near the point, or the vertex, or the part where the 2 legs or the 2 slanted sides come together at. And so McDowell had tried to go straight down from Washington straight toward Richmond. What McClellan is going to do is going to go to a different part of Virginia, the southeastern part. And in southeast Virginia, well, it's not even so much southeast, but on the eastern side of Virginia, there are several rivers. And they go basically essentially east-west. It's a little bit more like, southeast to northwest. But there's several major rivers. The first river, of course, is the Potomac River, and that would be, if you think of your triangle, I'm sure Scott will put some maps up on the website, but so you won't have to do well. If you can look at the map, if you're driving, please don't look at the map. But anyway, the Potomac River is the northernmost river, and that forms the border between Virginia and Maryland. Then the next river down, just think of like drawing 3 lines across the triangle. The next one is called the Rappahannock. And then after that, you have the York River. Then you have the James River, and the James River flows through Richmond. And what McClellan wanted to do was go down, and by the way, these rivers, before I mention McClellan's plan, one more thing about the rivers. They're very wide on the far eastern part of Virginia. They're like inlets almost, and then they gradually narrow as they go into the state, into the country, the middle of the state. And some of them divide into other rivers and whatnot. But on the far eastern side, the eastern shore of Virginia, these rivers are very wide, and so they form these little peninsulas that come out. What McClellan wanted to do was put the army on boats and transport it by water down the Potomac into the Chesapeake Bay, and then down to the peninsula between the Rappahannock and York rivers. And then the army would approach Richmond from the southeast. So he's going to go way around Johnston's army and come at Richmond from a totally different direction, behind Johnston's army. Well, Johnston finds out about this. There were a lot of spies. There were Confederate spies in Washington, D.C. Johnston finds out about this. And he he basically is going to move his army. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to that in a minute. McClellan, like I said, wanted to deposit his army on the eastern shore and then march inland towards Richmond. So, and on our triangle, that's on the right side. And McClellan was hoping that Johnson would have to retreat to Richmond and maybe even turn around and attack McClellan. And remember that the defense is favored in this war. We talked about the technology, the advanced weaponry, advanced for the time. And so you always wanted to be the one defending. You didn't want to be the one attacking, unless your name is Lee, of course, Jackson, but we'll talk about that later. McClellan liked the plan. He said, great plan. I'm sorry, Lincoln approved the plan. McClellan told Lincoln, and Lincoln said, yeah, this is great, do it. But McClellan stalls again. And Lincoln famously said to somebody, he said, if General McClellan isn't going to use his army, I'd like to borrow it for a time. It's like, can I borrow your army? Lincoln had all these funny statements. I love them. I'm going to try to work in as many as I can. In January of 1862, Lincoln finally orders him to move, and McClellan continues to stall. So keep in mind, it's been more than 6 months since the Battle of Bull Run, and McClellan is still stalling. Lincoln orders him to move, and finally in March of 1862, and this is now, 8 months after Bull Run, McClellan still hasn't moved. So Lincoln relieves him as general-in-chief. Remember how McClellan said, I can do it all? Well, apparently not. Lincoln decides, no, I really don't think he can do it all. So we'll keep him as army commander. He'll be the commander of the Army of the Potomac, but we'll get somebody else to be general-in-chief. All right. So McClellan begins embarking his troops. And remember, this is like 120,000 people, or at least over 100,000. I can't remember exactly how many actually go down to Virginia. They have to leave some behind in Washington, obviously, to make sure the Confederates don't sneak into Washington while they're not looking. But Johnston finds out about this, as I mentioned earlier, and he moves his army back to the Rappahannock River. So he retreats back toward Richmond a little bit. And then McClellan decides to change his plan, and he's going to deploy the army a little bit further south. He's going to go to Fortress Monroe, or Fort Monroe. Fort Monroe was a Union fort that the Confederates never took, and it's on the tip of the peninsula that's between the York River and the James River, okay, the bottom two rivers that I mentioned. So McClellan starts bringing troops down to Fort Monroe. There it is, 70,000 soldiers initially set out for Fort Monroe, okay? 70,000 soldiers leave. Johnston shifts the bulk of his army to the peninsula, and he puts them in between McClellan and Richmond. So much for this idea of just marching into Richmond. Johnston gets there, and he begins to dig in and set up some defensive works. And then another 35,000 troops that had been in Washington, they go to Fredericksburg, Virginia, which is 50 miles north of Richmond, and they're under our good old friend, General Irvin McDowell, the loser of Bull Run. That wasn't his nickname at the time, but we can call him that now.
For posterity.
Anyway,
yeah.
So, yeah, for posterity. Good old McDowell. He just wasn't really up to the task. So General Johnston, the commander of the Confederate Army in Virginia, he's got some Federals to the south and some from the north. And you'd think that the Federals maybe could have them work together and do a kind of like a pincer attack on Richmond. We'll see if that happens. Another 25,000 troops go to the Shenandoah Valley under Nathaniel Banks, and we're going to talk about the Shenandoah Valley and what happened there next time. And then also 10,000 troops from Washington go out to Western Virginia under John C. Fremont, the Pathfinder, who was recently fired from Missouri. So we'll move him and see if he could do better in Western Virginia. Johnston sends... So you think, man, there's Federal soldiers all over the place. There's like 4 different armies. This ought to be the end of the Confederacy. But Johnston sends 5,000 soldiers under Stonewall Jackson, who we met in our very first episode, or the second one of the first 2. Anyway, Stonewall Jackson takes 5,000 soldiers out to the valley, the Shenandoah Valley. And that's where I'm going to leave off for now, and we'll pick it up next time. Scott, anything you want to add or ask?
Yeah, well, one thing, I know the how of McClellan, that he is very slow, and later on we'll see this is some of the biggest mistakes made in the Civil War, and you can imagine. So I know the how of it, and I can see that he's doing Napoleonic tactics. He has many different armies moving around. He's trying to penetrate deep into enemy territory for a decisive blow. But the Napoleonic characteristic he doesn't have is movement. So what is the why of it? Why is he so slow? Is he overly deliberate?
I think he is, and we'll see this next time, is he constantly overestimates the number of troops that his enemy has. Back when Lincoln was telling him, just go march straight down to Richmond, for goodness sakes, just do it. He would say, no, they have 150,000, they have 200,000. And I'll be fair. To be fair to McClellan, it wasn't entirely his fault. McClellan actually had Alan Pinkerton working for him as a scout, as a spy. Pinkerton had been was a bodyguard off and on for Abraham Lincoln, and of course he founds the famous Pinkerton Security Agency that is still around today. But Pinkerton told McClellan he thought there were 150,000 rebels just south of Washington, which is way more than that's more than twice what they really had. So McClellan had faulty intelligence, but he also, I think he was just very timid, and we'll get into this next time some more, but he loved his army probably a little too much, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I can see that.
Robert E. Lee famously said one time that the paradox of being the commander of an army is that you have to love your army, but you also have to be willing to order the destruction of the thing that you love.
And he was willing.
Yeah, Robert E. Lee was definitely willing to do that. McClellan, not at all, or barely. McClellan, he loved his soldiers so much, he didn't want them to get hurt. He was like an overprotective parent. So those are two of the reasons, and there were other things, and we'll see some other reasons he moved so slowly next time. But I just don't think he had that killer instinct. He didn't have that fighting spirit that a lot of the more successful generals are going to have, as we'll see.
Well, there are revisionist historians today who are questioning the mythical military genius of Robert E. Lee, but McClellan, probably few people made that charge in the beginning except for himself. So, as we can see,
right?
Yeah, not something that comes up.
Yeah.
All right. Well, yeah, that is the episode. And in the next one, we're going to get into the thick of the Peninsula Campaign. Thanks for listening to the Key Battles in the Civil War podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show in the podcast player of your choice and leave us a rating and a review. This helps us grow and reach new listeners. You can also find maps of the battle sites, show notes to each episode, and plenty of other history info by going to keybattlesinthecivilwar.com.